my laboratory really works on one of the greatest challenges of neuroscience, which is how the brain drives adaptive behavior. And as part of this quest, we really try to combine neuroscience, engineering, and machine vision in order to answer these types of questions. Our kind of collective mission is really to understand foundational principles in neural computations in order to build next-gen adaptive AI systems. And so what I'd like to do today is tell you about our efforts related to machine vision in our laboratory. So as you probably know, adaptive behavior can really span a huge state space, right? So anything from more classical trial-based behaviors, which is still quite interesting, to certainly taking these things into the wild and back, bringing the wild into the laboratory, which has its own rich and interesting history. And of course, complex motor actions, which we study in our laboratory. So just to give you a few examples, part of the work in our lab is not just on machine vision, but actually doing experimentations with animals to see how they adapt to the world. So here's a mouse that we teach to play joystick video games, even simple questions about timing and uncertainty, or more ethological tasks for mice, which in the one case where they're actually predators, they'll hunt crickets. This is collaboration with Chris Neal's group who developed this beautiful paradigm. And then just, of course, trying to understand the animal in its own ecological niche. Since these are laboratory mice, just actually studying them in their natural habitat, I think is quite fascinating for aspects of neuroscience and medicine as well. And so I just want to highlight a few things that when we started getting into this field a few years ago, there are particular challenges that we sort of saw that were unique to maybe animal pose estimation compared to the elegant and beautiful work in human pose estimation. And so, for example, it sounds kind of obvious, but humans have really different bodies, right? We couldn't leverage a skeleton or a pose prior across all species. So while these are all mice, visually they look quite different in this scenario. But even say a natural mouse feeding or other types of animals that have been used now in computer vision, like studying the hydraulic legs of spiders, or the fly example that Michael also nicely showed, or things like comparative biomechanics across different types of lizards and geckos and so forth. Another kind of challenge, if you will, is that it's not really practical to label really large-scale data sets. And so when we started this it was kind of unknown. Like, how little data could you get away with in order to make tailored neural networks for these types of applications? The other thing is, which I won't really touch much on today, but it needs to be quite fast. So in order to study the brain, we often want to do closed loop perturbations, where based on a behavioral event, you want to say, do an optogenetics-based perturbation in the neural circuitry. And so we need these tools to be very fast and even super real time with low latency. We also saw challenges for doing multi-animal tracking because they look really identical oftentimes. Like if you take two black mice in their home cage, they can look highly identical, even to a human observer. They're very hard to distinguish. And lastly, which I'll touch more on today, is that we're really interested in this vision of making robust, like plug and play solutions, right? So many of you are computer scientists in this room, but not all biologists or ethologists or ecologists have a rich computer science background. And so to make these tools broadly accessible is actually takes quite a bit of work, but we can also try to engineer better solutions in order to give these tools back to the community and really democratize AI in that way. I sort of think of it as I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, many of you in this room, and kind of paying it forward to the rest of the life science community. So I'll talk a bit more about that today as well. Okay, and so I know this is a bit of a diverse audience, so this is probably very familiar to most of you, but just in case, there's an incredible rich history in human markerless pose estimation, starting back from deep pose and incredible algorithms like DeeperCut and OpenPose and convolutional pose machines, all the way up to now kind of benchmark topping things like higher HRNet. And so in general, many of these algorithms work in a similar way, which is that you have supervised ground truth data, you have a predictor, which in this case is a neural network, and you get out a pose. There's a lot of free parameters, so kind of back of the envelope calculations can tell you that you need a lot of labeled data potentially. And we know that deep learning is really accelerating in the performance domain when you have this large amount of data. And so for us, when we started back in 2017, we sort of saw these as data hungry algorithms. And I think we all probably agree that they still are, but we wanted to know how we could bring this to the laboratory. And so the short answer is essentially to leverage transfer learning, which you're probably familiar with, which is namely taking a trained network and asking it to learn a new task. So I think most famously, ImageNet has had an incredible influence on the field for a multitude of reasons, but also pre-trained on ImageNet has become quite a popular and almost standard technique now in many computer vision applications. And so just to walk you through this is a large data set of over 1.2 million images with many classes, many animals and fruits and all kinds of things. Typically what you do is you take a network for, say, classification, you showed a picture of this cat and it should give you the label cat, right? And so what we did is building and inspired on DeeperCut actually, when they were sort of leveraging on some really nice algorithmic developments in Deep Lab, was to essentially take a pre-trained network and leverage this to get away with very little data. So now what you can do is essentially label the key points of interest. So in our case, right, I kind of showed you this, we're interested in mouse reaching. So here's 13 key points on the hand. You fine tune this network end to end and have new deconvolutional heads, and you can get away with very little data. So this was trained on roughly, 140 images. The mice that it now can work on are not in the initial data set, so it generalized as well. So this was our first paper in this path. And I highlight a few down here that we've worked on in the subsequent years as well. So the package has really changed dramatically over the years. We try to stay up with state of the art. We have a lot more networks, many ImageNet pre-trained backbones, and a plethora of other tools, and some of them I'll highlight today for you. And so just to define what I mean by efficient to some degree is in this first paper, what we actually showed was that we first built a data set, a benchmark of mice. And here, just to give you a sense of scale, the nose is about 10 pixels wide. And we showed that, very little data, now not into the thousands, but into the tens, around like 50 images, give you a biologically meaningful performance level, right? So if the objective here was to label the nose of the mouse, the nose is 10 pixels, so even tens of frames actually give you a really reasonable performance. And a few hundred frames, now you're matching human level accuracy for the best labeler that we could find. As I mentioned, it also generalizes, of course, to unseen animals, which, black 6 mice to the aficionados, they can be quite different. They're different sizes, different ages, different sexes, but also these networks are not, they're able to also say, like, if you put 3 mice in a similar setting, you'll also be able to detect the poses of multiple animals in this scenario. I think importantly for the life scientist too, so I just point this out, that the ability to know if a network has done a good job or leverage something about the confidence of the network is really useful, particularly in the cases of highly articulated objects and occlusions, because this was something that was quite challenging with many of the conventional or other approaches at the time to do. And so this allows you, of course, then to label, say, a fly that's moving around in 3D space and get both in the left and the right side covered, but not plotting data that's off the animal, of course, when it's not seen. And just as a kind of a highlight here to say that it doesn't just work on animals, there's been a lot of really interesting applications. So for example, tracking cancer cells and how they lyse in medical applications. So in the larynx, or measuring tendons in humans during performance, down to, of course, Multianimal, which I'll talk about more. So we've been really fortunate to have a huge uptake in the field. We just hit 230 downloads this week, which I'm quite excited about, and also just maintaining and engaging with this community has been a big part of this software project. And we've been lucky enough to be also featured and have our users featured in some popular media outlets, helping to spread this tool to many different fields from ecology to life sciences. And just to kind of recap on that, I think, a large part of Deep Lab Cut's success, maybe aside from the scientific contribution about transfer learning, was really the usability of this tool and making it an entire software package. So going from, say, training these networks or developing data sets, applying different data augmentation types, different network selections, and then be able to run new inference and do this kind of all through a graphical user interface was one of the things that we really wanted to make sure that our users could do. So that's really allowed a couple different ways to this software to develop. One is sort of a plug-in to a lot of, say, neuroscience specific things, or like real-time pose estimation platforms. But also then there's been a huge community around this that has built tools like taking the output of pose estimation. And so of course I'm primarily talking about deep lab cut, but as Michael rightly noted, the field is growing and it's really exciting. There's so many really nice tools coming out now, and across, many different groups, including those from like Ian Cousin and others. And so it's been very fun collectively as a community to see what people are doing with the outputs of such pose estimation packages. So just to give you a few, and a nod to Muybridge, who, as Michael noted, actually had a scientific question about whether the horse lifted all 4 legs off the ground. Now, hopefully he would be impressed that he no longer had to build a zoopraxiscope to study this type of behavior, but could use computer vision to do this. All right, so in the next few slides, I just want to give you some case studies. So this was some work in collaboration with Amir Patel's group at University of Cape Town, South Africa. So he's a biomechanicist and roboticist who's interested in optimal kind of tail locomotion in these cheetahs. This is work that was just published at ICRA last month. But in general, for this community, I just want to highlight it. They're also at the poster session tonight. But it's a large-scale data set of over 7,000 frames, and particularly more than 20,000 3D frames of cheetahs essentially in the wild. So I encourage you to check that out and talk to them for more information. Recently, we've also been working on this problem of multi-animal pose estimation, looking at really identical looking animals. So what we did is develop 4 benchmark data sets that I'm showing you here. So from swimming fish, from multiple mice to marmosets, to parenting mice, where the pups look really identical. And through the course of building kind of optimizations around this multi-animal problem, we've also been building new network architectures. And so we've tested these against, say, state-of-the-art models on COCO or other multi-human pose estimation benchmarks, and do show that we have state-of-the-art performance on these data sets compared to those data. So we used some of the pose implementations and others, and this data in this network is now available as well through Deep Lab Cut. And so Jesse and the other authors will be here tonight if you want to get more information. But I do want to just kind of highlight one kind of interesting thing to think about in, humans are animals, of course, but, animal pose estimation compared to humans. One thing is this body agnosticism. Right, so it's not necessarily obvious when you take a network and you're, say, doing both learning the body parts with like key points, but also then, building the limbs like part affinity fields, much inspired by open pose, what limbs should actually be connected. And so to do that, we built kind of an adaptive graph-based algorithm that can, say, take what we might consider a baseline or naive skeleton, but then also try to find a data-driven skeleton for this, right? So I think this is probably one of the reasons, or we sort of know this is one of the reasons that these networks are actually doing a better job, because we've optimized them to do better graph assembly for this. So here what I'm showing you are just some of the output metrics of this, namely how many unconnected body parts are left and the purity of the assembly at this stage of the thing. So baseline here is, as I mentioned, sort of naive skeleton, and then this data-driven graph pruning algorithm that we developed. And then another algorithm that essentially is a calibration. So it takes in a prior cost of like a pose prior of these learned edge associations. So the discriminability of the different edges along the skeleton. And so in the next, am I doing on time? Yeah, so in the next part of my talk, what I wanted to kind of give you a vision is about kind of the robustness and where we're going with these types of tools. So I hope I've convinced you that Deep Lab Cut and related animal pose estimation software packages have really risen to the challenge of kind of solving this for the one lab experiment, or even within a lab, right? You take mice, you can build these networks, they're reasonably robust on your setting. But how will this look if we really want to share like these networks or data sets across labs, or even across, say, an entire animal group like quadrupeds? Or maybe across all mammals? Like, is there a way that we can leverage like all this data that people are amassing to do this in a more interesting way? And so, simply, the larger the scale of this, the greater the diversity. So we're trying to think about interesting ways in order to like leverage this data smartly. Okay, so our question really is how can we create more generalizable, if you will, robust pose estimation networks for the users? And so to do this, as many people do in computer vision, we started with a benchmark. So it's not the Wiseman horse data set, but we developed a new data set, which we call horse 10. So this is around 8,000 images of thoroughbred racehorses that sails across the United States. And they were labeled by an expert equinist who really knew the key points in the anatomy of horses super well. And so the general idea is that all the horses are actually walking left to right. They're all roughly the same age at these sales, but of course they have very different coat colors. There's different image statistics with the backgrounds. They have different handlers, so on and so forth. And so the challenge was, if we train on a small subset of these individuals, how well could these networks actually generalize to horses that we consider like out of domain individuals? And oh yeah, this is my reminder to tell you that all this data is linked on papers with code. So if you're interested in playing with this benchmark or the data sets, it's all of course available there. So the first thing we wanted to ask in this work, which was published this year at WACV, was how good are these different backbone architectures? Is there anything inherently better about better ImageNet performing architectures for pose estimation? So Kaiman Hay and others have also looked at this now in the context of object recognition and other challenges. But what we found is largely in the same vein as what they found, which is that for pose estimation, these networks that are better on ImageNet are actually performing better for pose estimation. So I didn't put the network names here, but we tested a lot of different mobile nets, ResNets, and the state-of-the-art efficient nets as well. And so what you're seeing here is the blue is of course the train, the test is within domain. So on these 10 horses, it's just held out images from these animals. And then the kind of interesting test is this out of domain, right? So these unseen horses that we actually see. And so you do see that these more powerful architectures generalize better, which was maybe a bit surprising given that they have many more free parameters and could be prone to overfitting. And this is pre-trained on ImageNet backbones, which will become important in a moment. And so in general, what we found is that pre-training really matters. That's kind of the take home. I'm not showing you the data here, but you can train for less time, up to 6 times less with half the amount of data and get the same amount of performance. But importantly, compared to training from scratch, where you see this huge gap between the transfer learning based networks, so pre-trained on ImageNet or training from scratch, especially for these higher performing networks, there's this huge gap to fill. So even just using these pre-trained networks for animal pose estimation is already giving you quite a boost in performance in this robustness domain. To kind of contrast this to the domain shift that might be inherent in the horse 10 task, right, this out of domain individual, we built in a horse C, right? So from Dan Hendricks and colleagues, you're probably familiar with ImageNet C. And so we took these same corruptions and essentially corrupted these horses to see how well that they would be, or how well these networks would perform in this kind of challenging set. And so I'm not showing all the data here, of course, but we tested different domain adaptation techniques in order to try to close this gap. But again, just as a take home, these transfer learning, so the starred lines here, are always better than the from scratch training on these networks. So again, showing that there's a kind of a benefit for this pre-training, and also for batch norm and test time adaptation techniques worked as well. Okay, but what if we think broader here? This is horses, but what about across species? So there's a nice paper at ICCV a few years ago, which introduced this animal pose data set. And so we took this data set, and what we did was say train on all the sheep data in the data set, but then test on the held out species. And here again, by class, like mobile nets, ResNets, efficient nets, you saw the same trend that we saw before on the horses. Namely that better ImageNet performing architectures performed better on this out of domain robustness challenge. But kind of going forward, we want to think kind of broader, right? So what if we could build data sets that were better than ImageNet for pre-training, that kind of had more of a pose, prior, if you will, and animals certainly are more represented in the data sets. So we started collecting data sets from others and ourselves, from macaque pose, which is also here tonight, which is very cool, Stanford dogs, the animal pose data set, Baja. So I think many of the people in this room are represented in this data set that we collected. And so in total, we had around 50,000 images now that had maybe slightly different key points. So there was some kind of fun things that we had to do to solve, how to train the same backbone and not penalize missing key points or key points that weren't expressed in other data sets. So we built a gradient masking techniques. We tried to map them across these data sets. And the short answer is that this does improve pre-training compared to ImageNet pre-training. So these are the source domains if you're interested. And again, we have a poster tonight, so you can talk to Xiaoke, the first author of this work, about this in more detail. And then we had some held out data sets for testing in this way. So we built a new data set, which we call iRodents, based on iNaturalist. So we scrubbed iNaturalist and labeled a ton of different rodents from this, and then had more kind of lab related work as well. And so qualitatively, what we found very early on, or in this test, is that you can get away with smaller amounts of target fine-tuned dating. So even with 16 images of your new domain, using this kind of super animal pre-training model base is better than ImageNet. And this, of course, is quantifiable. And so I'm not going through all the details here, but we also kind of mixed and matched and combined different data sets to see which ones could confer a positive transfer versus ones which might actually hurt performance. And so you can actually kind of come up with a formula of which data sets are better to combine for your target domain. But in general, we found overall that most always the super animal kind of model outperformed ImageNet pre-training. And importantly, it even gave this out of domain robustness test on horse 10 gave it about 11% MAP improvement in this challenge as well. This is just kind of ongoing work, but I also want to highlight that, of course, we're also looking at other things besides domain adaptation techniques. We're also interested in self and semi-supervised learning. And so we found that these super animal models were also very good at supervised learners. So this gave about a 2x improvement, especially in this low target regime data of using pseudo labeling to enhance performance. So just coming kind of towards this like larger vision of sharing networks and sharing data, we last year launched what we call the Deep Lab Cut Model Zoo, kind of a tongue-in-cheek name, given that we work on so many animals. But the idea here is that without any installation of the software, people can just use Google Colab. They simply can click like cat or dog. There's some amazing user contributed things like primate faces or the model from macaque pose. Humans, of course, you can just go and upload a video and run inference for these different animals on your data set. And of course, the cheetahs, in case you have any really big cats at home. And so what we're really trying to do now in this way is to, actually just ask you as a call of action for many of the life scientists or those that are interested in computer vision is to help us make better models by making these better data sets. So we've launched this web app. If you're interested, if you have some free time and want to, click on really adorable animals from across these cool data sets, go to contrib.deeplabcut.org. And this is all going back into this community-driven effort of building better models for these plug-and-play type solutions. All right, so I think I'm good on time, so I'm going to make sure I wasn't over today. So the kind of the take homes here, and again, here's the nod to Mar of this really amazing legacy, which we also cover in a recent piece in Current Opinion about how incredible that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. But I hope in this short talk I've convinced you that deep learning has really revolutionized our ability to analyze animal behavior with higher precision and at scale that was never before possible in life sciences. We think that they have particularly interesting challenges in animal pose estimation and even maybe novel solutions. So I think there's a real opportunity here to bridge across the domains in other interesting ways. I showed you that we built an adaptive data-driven assembly, which boosts performance compared to, say, higher HRNet, which is current state-of-the-art on COCO. Our pre-trained ImageNet networks offer known advantages, namely like these shorter training times and less data requirements, but importantly, they have a novel advantage, which is this robustness to out-of-domain data, which we think a lot of the life scientists sort of find themselves in this regime. Of course, there's still a gap to close, right? I didn't solve everything in the last few years. And so we're very much interested in kind of new techniques that are being driven across, whether that's transformers or batch norm, self-supervised learning and better pre-training. And so I kind of hinted at a few of these things that we can start to close this gap with. And importantly, I think, thinking about this, it's also kind of an exciting time to think about like which data sets are conferring positive versus negative transfer and how we can better leverage all this amazing community data that is coming in. With that, I want to thank, of course, my amazing collaborators and my group at EPFL and my former lab at Harvard, the people that really were involved in the work today, Jesse Lauer, Xiaoke Yi, Tian Q, Stefan Schneider, Maxine Vidal, Mu Zhu, and my longstanding collaborator, Alex Mathis, who really spearheaded all of this work with me today.